Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. It's just, I created some people. I think so.
It's sort of eerie watching IT do things from remotely wherever they are.
This whole building is remote. It's, oh, by the way, I'm gonna stop talking and run over there and do show up.
I know, right? I mean, they come through all the time. I have a great picture of a deer like in the bush directly out the window, like looking in.
So I would respectfully suggest that you do this and then turn the mic off and then I'll turn it on. Just, I don't know.
Feedback.
It's such a cool new facility. They probably have thought of feedback.
Oh, I don't know. I'm so technologically. I think those are one of our nursing professors. Probably.
Oh, we're just.
I think that was them.
Okay.
Perfect. So now all the little zoomy things are away. And we should be good.
All right.
That's Native American Bigfoot.
Yay! Whiskey zoning.
Oh, it's possible when your horses is in the car.
Yes. She's actually a Harvey Mudd alumni.
Oh, yeah.
So they were in SoCal for quite a while.
First chance. That's what I got. And I prepared it, I cleaned it up and looked just like the original. So it's maybe that's really crazy. He was printed on that. On display. So that's what he wasn't aware of. Only the homemade air, homemade helicopter fly over the first. So.
Okay, I'd love to welcome everyone to another geology lecture series. I promise once I'm totally settled into a new job here, it'll be a little more frequent. And before I introduce today's speaker, we'll have a brief hiatus over summer, but I have 2 speakers lined up for fall quarter. So we're trying to get back on the 2 talks a quarter. So in fall, I'll have Dr. Marty Miller, who is the author of Roadside Geology of Oregon and Oregon Rocks, who is both a professional photographer and a structural geologist giving a talk. I don't know quite yet. She said either photography or Death Valley. So one of those 2 things, either way, we'll have tons of pretty pictures and be awesome. And then our other speaker lined up for fall is Patrick O'Grady, who is a Bureau of Land Management archaeologist who is working on the oldest site of human occupation in Oregon. So an 18,000-year-old site in Oregon, so that'll have a bit of fossils, cool rocks, a lot of dirt. It'll be a good time. So tonight's speaker, I'm super happy to introduce my really good friend, Eric Scott. Eric Scott is one of the very first people who ever kind of took me under their wing, and it's his fault in part that I'm here as a paleontologist. And it was one of my other examples in why mammals are the coolest thing to study, and not team dinosaurs. Not that there's anything wrong with dinosaurs, but go mammals. So Eric Scott is the vice president and principal paleontologist let's see if I get all these words in the right order, of Hogstone Resource Management. There will be a quiz for me afterwards, I've already failed it. And so basically this is a thing that is coming soon to Oregon. So Eric has a little bit about this, but in the state of California, if you find fossils during construction, they have to be remediated the same way that archaeological material is. And part of why I really wanted Eric to come and give a talk is that this is something that's going to be coming to Oregon in the next year or two. There's currently legislation in place to provide some sort of protection and remediation for fossils that we find on public lands here in Oregon. This will be a bunch of new jobs for students in the audience. In addition, Eric also is a professor at California State University, San Bernardino, and has been teaching the love of fossils for quite a long time. I won't say how long, sorry. His specialty is in Ice Age horses and bison, and in a specific area we call biogeography. So where are things and why are they there? And how did they get in between 2 places or 5 places? And then why did they disappear sometimes? And this has led to one of my all-time favorite papers that I occasionally make students read. Those of you in my class, stay tuned for 2 weeks from now, which introduces the hypothesis of the alien killer bison. I see you maybe didn't want me to bring that one up, but I really like it and you should ask them about it later. So without further ado, let's hear about some horses and the ice ages and all along the West Coast.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? I would think so. Good God. Okay, well, thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. And again, my name is Eric, and I'm going to try and get you out of here in under an hour. But when you take on a subject like horses, there's a lot of material to cover, so I hope you'll bear with me. It's nice to be up here in your wonderful weather. This is actually where I've been working for the past couple of weeks in the field. This is, anybody recognize this? No, this is outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, and most people don't think about this part of Las Vegas, Nevada, but these are the groundwater discharge deposits that crop out towards the north end. And those deposits have fossils in them. This is actually what's left of a fossil mammoth. We've actually been excavating that over the past couple of weeks. And this is work within this area for what's known as Tule Springs Fossil Beds National Monument. And it has a very abundant Ice Age assemblage representing a variety of different time periods from the end of the Ice Ages. And so we are excavating in mammoth. I was hoping to work on horses, and in fact, the Las Vegas deposits have produced fossil horses. Would you like to see some of them? Here you go. Are you excited? This is, for those of you not familiar with paleontology and maybe watching things on television when almost everything you see is some spectacular find, I think in most cases, this is the sort of thing you find is isolated fragments. That is a horse tooth, but it's not necessarily the most exciting thing you've ever seen. And for well over a century at Tule Springs, those are the kinds of fossils that were being produced. These are all horse fossils. As you can see, they're all relatively broken, fragmentary, and not terribly informative. However, there's also lower jaws like this one, but it's not as helpful in terms of the information it provides as it might be. However, all that changed in the year 2012 with an excavation that was intended to remove a mammoth that is at this site. And instead of a mammoth, the mammoth is there. But instead of a mammoth, what we hit was a baby horse tooth. And this is what it looked like coming out of the ground. And when we actually excavated the whole thing, we had a lower jaw and a partial skull, which was terribly informative, at least for me as somebody who studies fossil horses. I particularly want to point you to the front end. There's a lot of feedback I'm getting here. I'm not sure what's up. Can you hear that hum, or is it just me? I don't know how to turn it down. No, I won't do that. No, bear with me. The audio visual is out of my control. I'll try not to talk so loud. Anyway, this is the front end of, I'm sorry? Is that what it is? Is that better? that's better. Okay. Anyway, keep this estimate in mind because I'm going to ask you about it later. But what I want you to look at is those two little cups of the animal. These are lower in size just on the spec. And those two cups of the animal are going to be significant. So, as we said, that will be later. Now, that is. Hi. Now I'm not on camera, that won't work. Hi. Anyway. That's a horse, and those are the sort of animals that I would like to study. And just to upset you all, this is not why I became a paleontologist. This is why I became a paleontologist. Yes, I agree with you about dinosaurs, but when I was a 6-year-old boy, this was what made me decide I wanted to be a dinosaur scientist. It was in this book that my mom got me to teach me about dinosaurs. So for those of you who are parents or grandparents, parents gave kids some books on dinosaurs, you never know where it might take them. But this is what I wanted to study. The problem is that I grew up in California and we didn't have any dinosaurs there. We have rocks from the age of dinosaurs in California, but they are marine rocks, and so dinosaurs are very rare. The good news for me is that we didn't have the gray targets within about a half an hour drive from my home. So that was helpful. And then in the mid-1970s, this gentleman, George C. Page, actually spent $5 million back when that was money to build what became known as the George C. Page Museum. And so in 1978, at the age of 16,
This one might be less feedback.
at the age of 16, that works. Okay. In 1978, at the age of 16, thank you. That was a great suggestion. At the age of 16, I became a volunteer at the La Brea Tar Pits and started learning all about paleontology, started picking microfossils, started putting broken bones back together and so on. And as part of that experience, I encountered a number of actual working paleontologists, many of whom took me under their wing and taught me how to be how to become a paleontologist. And one of the things I noticed with these individuals is that each one of them had their own study animal. Shelley Cox up there in the upper left was studying fossil short-faced bears. George Jefferson studied bison. Christopher Shaw studied saber-toothed cats. Bill Ackerston studied saber-toothed cats and rodents. So in my 16-year-old brain, what I decide is, if I want to be a paleontologist, I need an animal. And the only animal that nobody was working on at the tar pits was the horse. And so I'm not, for those of you who are listening or are here because you love horses, I agree with you, but I had to grow into that. At the time, I did not care about horses. I was just there to be a paleontologist. But this is the horse that I started to study. This is the extinct Western horse. The scientific name is Equus occidentalis. And this is the mount that you can see even today at the La Brea Tar Pits. And I was very fortunate because even though plant-eating animals are not as well represented as meat eaters at the tar pits because it's a carnivore trap. You get one dumb horse stuck and it'll attract a bunch of dire wolves and a bunch of saber-toothed cats. Nevertheless, because of the preservation capabilities of the tar pits, it is one of the richest sites anywhere for fossil horses from the ice ages. There are over 300 individuals of horses represented in their collections. It was the second most common plant-eating animal there after bison. So it was a spectacular assemblage from which to learn about ice age horses. I obviously, as a kid, already knew about horses. Horses are so very popular in American culture. I can't think of a single Western that has been made without having horses in it. I apologize for this slide because Harrison Ford is in it twice and Clint Eastwood is in it twice. So, you know, but still, it kind of conveys the idea that horses are really well established in the American psyche. But in reality, in North America, horses have a critical component as well in the history and prehistory of the way this country developed. In fact, a recent paper that came out just last year discussed how horses dispersed. Once Europeans brought them to North America, it was actually indigenous people who then helped spread them throughout the continent long before the arrival of later European colonizers. That said, when those later European colonizers arrived, they also promoted the expansion of horses all across the continent. And then as cities and communities built up in various areas, horses were integral to that, at least until the start of the industrial age. But from a paleontological perspective, it's also important, again, for me to have learned that horses were common. They're one of the most common Ice Age animals anywhere. You don't hear about them because they aren't as sexy as mammoths or saber-toothed cats or ground sloths. But when you think about the various Ice Age assemblages there, from California to Nevada to Idaho, the Hagerman beds, to Florida, to up in Alberta and British Columbia, wherever you find assemblages of large Ice Age mammals, you're almost certain to find Ice Age horses along with them. They were one of the critical animals in North American Ice Age faunas. And then those animals led to all of the horses that we think of today, not just domestic horses, but burros and zebras as well. All of these living species had their ancestry in North American animals, which might come as a surprise to some of you if you grew up like I did, being told that the Spanish brought horses to North America. Technically, that's correct, but technically that was a reintroduction of horses. It wasn't a new thing, it was the return of an old thing. Horses did their own distribution across the globe long before people got involved. They have a history on this continent that goes back more than 55 million years. And from North America, they spread out throughout the rest of the world on their own, with the exception of Australia and Antarctica. How did they do that? You may be familiar with this, but I'll tell you anyway. This is a representation of Earth and its oceans and its continents and its coastlines today. If you go back to the end of the ice ages and you put those glaciers in there, you can see that the sea level has dropped. You can notice particularly Florida has gotten rather fast. And what has happened up between Alaska and Siberia is that what today is water during this period became dry land, and that dry land is called Beringia. And so during periods of peak glaciation, when Beringia was exposed, you had animals able to cross over from one continent to the other. So you had animals like mammoths and bison moving into North America, and animals like horses moving out of North America into the old world. In no case did any of these animals wait to get their bearings straight. You can laugh better than that. I don't mean to imply that this is a one-time thing. This is a paper that came out in 2001 based on genetic information that documented that horses crossed over and then crossed back and then crossed over and then crossed back. So there was an interplay of movement back and forth to continents. It wasn't just unidirectional. There were multiple immigration and emigration events over the course of the end of the ice ages. That's documented right there. However, once horses did make it into the old world, they became relatively well established in Europe, Asia, and Africa. And people noticed them. In fact, if you look at early cave paintings, horses are among the most commonly depicted animals. So even though they're descended from North American animals, in Europe, where they're painting them, horses just really catch on. And then about 5,000 years ago or so, give or take, something new happens. And people start domesticating these animals. And horses were perfect from a human perspective for domestication. Based on what Jared Diamond has published, these are the characteristics that you're looking for in animals that you're going to domesticate. They can have a flexible diet, they subsist on low quality forage, they have a fast growth rate, they can breed in captivity, they're fairly pleasant to be around, they're relatively calm, and perhaps most importantly, they have a social structure that allows humans to insert themselves into it. For those of you familiar with horses, you probably realize that you are becoming the dominant force in that animal's life. It has a social structure that enables you to do that. And so that's one of the critical things. If you think about animals that we have domesticated, in almost every case, they meet these criteria. Though I think a very strong argument could be made that cats actually domesticated us. I'm just going to say that this is Nefertiti, and she's making it very clear that I should get by on lower quality forage and maybe have a more pleasant disease. Anyway, let's not get into the nitpicking. There's a variety of ways to domesticate animals, 3 to be precise. Number 1 is what's known as the commensal path. pathway. And this is a partnership that develops. And if you think of dogs and the relationship that we have with dogs, the domestication event involved partnering to sharing duties, having two different organisms that have shared goals, shared approaches, both hunting, both roving, doing all those things. And so they start to come together and they start to share that responsibility. They team up and each of them benefits from that relationship. There's the prey pathway, which is very straightforward. One of them wants to eat the other one. So you want to domesticate these animals so that you have a ready supply of food. And there's the directed pathway. This is where you're domesticating these animals for a specific purpose. In this case, doing some plowing, doing some heavy pulling, heavy lifting, things of that nature. So that's the three ways you can domesticate animals. With that in mind, how do horses fit into that? Well, horses are prey animals. They are herbivores. They have their eyes on the side of their head rather than in the front of their head like we do or wolves do, what have you. So right off the bat, they're coming at it from a different sort of approach than you'd expect from things like wolves. Now, and this is an in-joke, it's a trigger warning, but for those of you who don't want to see what a dinner of horse looks like, maybe look away right now, because horse meat actually can be prepared pretty well, and it tastes pretty good. This is from a restaurant in Canada. And I'm just throwing that in there to emphasize that the prey pathway appears to be the first reason that horses were domesticated. They were domesticated as a source of food. And so that is something to keep in mind. And the reason they were domesticated is because of where they were domesticated, which we'll talk about in a moment. But in snowy areas and icy areas like this, you can't necessarily get by with sheep or goats or cattle, because sheep or goats will dig with their noses, so will cattle. And if they hit a rind and they damage their noses or bloody their noses, they'll stop digging. And if the grass is under the snow, those animals will die. Cattle are even dumber. They don't know the grass is down there because they can't see it. So they will just stand there in a snowy field and starve. Whereas horses will dig through the snow with their hooves and expose the grass and eat it and then move on and do some more digging. And then the cattle and the sheep and the goats can come in after them and have access to the grass they leave behind. And so it's part of a system in these areas where horses were a logical candidate for domestication as a food source. They also are capable of pulling heavy gear, so they could have been domesticated for this. But this is the critical one. This is where the domestication pathway takes a totally different turn, because again, we're talking about a plant-eating animal, and yet at some point, somebody got the bright idea to sit on their back and ride them. And the entire relationship changed to the point where some of you might be upset with that picture of food and not even want to think about horses as food because we think of them as partners. But it started here. And the reason it started in part is because horses are evolved to have very heavy, very rigid backbones that are perfectly suited for riding. That's not their purpose. Their purpose is to, the evolutionary reason for that strong spine is to hold up their heavy guts. They have an enormous intestinal system, and they have that because they're digesting very low quality forage, stuff like grass, which, as Wynn mentioned, has a lot of grass and silica and glass and silica and stuff in it. It's very coarse, and so it takes a while to break down. And so they have these enormous guts, and they're what's called hindgut fermenters. But what they also do, because it's low quality forage, is they eat a lot. That's why when I go out and try to take pictures of horses, almost all of them look like this, because those, you see all these glorious pictures of horses with their heads raised and their manes flowing. I can't get those pictures because the horses are busy eating all the time. A horse will eat up to 18 hours per day, every day. And it's not getting the nutrient from the high quality forage, it's getting it from the flow through. It's quantity, not quality. And so they keep eating, and I keep taking pictures, and they look like this, and they look like this. I was at Wynn's place this morning. Yeah, thanks, horse. It's just, they're not helping. One of these days I will get that picture and then I will retire. But until then, these are what horses are doing. And because of those heavy guts, they have a very, very strong and rigid backbone that cattle don't have, other ruminants don't have, but horses do. And as a consequence of that, when somebody finally had the bright idea to sit on them, they found that they're relatively comfortable and relatively stable when that animal's moving at a walk or a canter or a gallop. And so that's where things start. And so you start with the prey pathway, and then you can move into the directed pathway, but there's also that commensal pathway, which again revolutionized our relationship with horses, and I think is so critical to understanding the importance of horses to us today. You can also go this way through the directed pathway into the commensal pathway. With this in mind, let's look at the actual record for horse domestication. And it's been proposed that the earliest record of domesticating horses we know of is in a site known as Botai in Kazakhstan. And here they have actual what appear to be pens where these animals lived, corrals, and they have evidence of bit wear on the teeth. They have ceramic and clay vessels that have mare's milk preserved on the insides. I'd like to wonder about how much fun it would be to try and milk a wild mare, but a domestic one makes a lot more sense. And so the argument has been that this is where you start to see domestication happening. And that is still the argument today. But a recent study from 2018 looked at the genomic content, the genetic content of some of these animals, including horse remains from Botai. And what they discovered is actually, if you look at that green and blue stuff at the top, all that green is Botai horses. That is the genetic evidence obtained from those remains. And it is entirely separate from all other domestic horses. It has nothing to do with them. But if you look at the bottom, I don't know if this has a laser pointer. If you look at the bottom, do you see where it says SWOCC at the bottom of the green up top? The Botai horses are descended, or excuse me, the SWOCC's horses are descended from the Botai horses. And the Botai horses were domesticated, which means these horses that, at least again with me for my entire life, I watched television, these are the only remaining wild horses. They aren't, they're feral. They're descended from domesticated animals, which means there are no true wild horses on the planet. They died out at the end of the ice ages and we don't have any left. That's very sad. It doesn't make these animals any less important, but genetically they are not related to any living domestic horses, which then raises the point, if Botai is not where our domestic horses, they domesticated horses, but they're not related to our domestication events. So where did our domesticated horses come from? Well, there's a variety of potential candidates for this based on that same 2018 paper. But in one case here, there's some interesting information. This just came out in March of last year. And I like this because they weren't looking at horses, they were looking at people. But what they were seeing on the people was pathological evidence of riding horses. They saw that for those of you who ride horses and your back hurts and your legs hurt, and you said, you're affecting your body, and that can show up in your skeletons. And the same thing was happening with these people about 5,000 years ago. And the Pontic-Caspian steppe is connected with later horse dwellers who over in the Altai region, which bypasses Botai completely, which means horses were domesticated at least twice. And only one of those domestication events led to the domesticated horses that we think of today. So that's pretty cool. Which means what you had was, as far as we can tell, starting off with the prey pathway and moving directly to that commensal pathway. That appears to be the case, that they started domesticating them, and rather than using them for heavy duty, they started riding them. And again, that partnership, which we still enjoy today, the relationship that people have with horses, the way you're both working together, moving together, thinking together, that is such a special relationship. And it's with what used to be a prey animal. You don't get that with sheep or cows or goats. It's more like what people do with dogs, but it is a fully commensal relationship with these wonderful animals. And so again, I didn't come into horses as a kid, but I sure am there now because I think this is just an amazing development in terms of the domestication of this particular animal. That is not the case for donkeys. Donkeys, as far as we can tell, were domesticated for a different reason. They weren't domesticated for riding. They were probably domesticated for exactly this. They were domesticated for the directed pathway, for heavy lifting. And they were domesticated one time in Africa, 2,000 years before horses were domesticated. And the reason that they don't appear to have been domesticated for riding, there's no evidence that they were being ridden, and they don't appear to have been domesticated for meat, because number one, it's Africa, and there's plenty of other game animals there. You don't necessarily need the meat. That's number one. Number two, donkey meat tastes like ass. So it tastes like, come on, work with me here. That was my best joke. In any event, domesticated earlier and for a different reason. So, but still, so that partnership isn't necessarily there with donkeys. Once horses become part of the domesticated human society, things change again. And here it's horses revolutionizing us and changing the way we do things. And it can be depicted, if you go back to that cave art where you see horses depicted in all their wonder. There's a book on horses by an author named Wendy Rogers, who points out that by the time you get into art from the later period, horses become subservient to people. And when you see horses depicted in so much of this art, they are doing something for us. They are doing something for people. They have been knocked down from their plateau, and now they're just beasts of burden or what have you. They're still spectacular, they're still pretty, but the relationship has changed. However, in warfare, in commerce, in agriculture, in transportation, horses were integral to revolutionizing the way we live our lives. In fact, if you think about all the different things that the Americas have sent out to the rest of the world, some of them good, some of them not so good, some of them patently ridiculous, none of these things has the staying power or the impact of horses. Absolutely no competition. So I like to think of horses as being America's best export ever. Yay. I need to give this talk on the 4th of July. And that's interesting because horses went extinct here about 11,000 years ago and left no descendants, as far as we can tell. And so people tend to think of them as failures. That's why even though they're natives, and even though they're so successful, and even though they changed our relationship, the United States national mammal is the bison. That makes no sense to me at all. Bison are immigrants. They didn't come until about 190,000 years ago, and they didn't do anything except stand there and chew. However, I'm in the minority here. If you're going to suggest that maybe horses are failures for this reason and that they needed humans to keep them going, we just talked about how true wild horses aren't. I want you to keep in mind that horses includes zebras. And in many cases, zebras are doing just fine. If you go to East Africa today, you can see plain zebras all over the place. And if you try to tell them they are failures, they will sniff at you and dismiss you, though they won't say nay. This is Mexico. This is an actual Ice Age fossil tooth about 1 million years old as I found it in Mexico. And I want to emphasize that this, again, is how a lot of fossils are found. This is another fossil horse tooth that I found. I'm actually able to occasionally find fossils. And many people are. And in terms of horses, horse teeth are usually what people find because they're so hard. The same thing is happening now. Wynn asked me to talk about this briefly, but I work for a mitigation company, a consulting company, Cogstone Resource Management. What we do is go out on construction projects in Southern California and recover fossils that are protected by law. And this is one of our current field areas. Look good? You're looking in the wrong place. You've got to go 30, 40 feet below the ground where they're building the Los Angeles subway, the Purple Line extension. And as they're excavating for the subway, they're finding fossils. That is a juvenile mammoth skull as it appeared in the ground. This is 30 feet below the surface in Los Angeles. And that's true throughout the Los Angeles basin. And it's probably very true here that if you start digging, you're going to find fossils pretty much everywhere. With horses, though, it's teeth. We keep finding teeth. Why do we keep finding teeth? And what are the impacts? This is a list of named species from North America, named Ice Age horse species from North America. There are over 60 names here, and almost all of them are based on teeth. And I can guarantee you, not all of them are accurate. Why are we working with teeth? Why don't we work with something else? It's because teeth are what we're finding. And the reason we're finding teeth is because they are so hard. Your teeth, for example, this is what they look like. I'm sure you're familiar with the diagram. You've got enamel capping your teeth if they're healthy. You've got dentine on the inside, and then down in the gums, you've got cementum holding everything together. Pretty standard human tooth configuration. And for those of you who don't take care of your teeth or who have maybe weak teeth, if you wear through that enamel cap and expose the dentine, it's called a cavity, and it's bad. And you have to go to the dentist or the orthodontist, and you have to get that fixed. With horse teeth, they're evolved to wear exactly that way. Those caps that you see on this horse tooth, again from Mexico, will wear down because of the coarseness of what they're eating, because of the coarseness of the grass and the glass and the silica and dust and grit that are in those plants. And so this is what a tooth looks like end on. And this is the enamel. And you can see there is a lot of enamel reinforcing this tooth. Again, evolved to process, to keep eating 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, for however long the animal is alive. And that's how it's able to do that. This is the dentine on the inside, which wears faster than the enamel. So there's always a raised ridge of enamel. And then this is the cementum on the outside. And because of all that enamel, these teeth fossilize really, really well. And so they become very commonly preserved. Also, horse teeth are very tall in the jaw because, again, they're going to be chewing for a long time. And so when you think about each horse having multiple teeth, 24 teeth, not counting the incisors in front, just those big, heavy cheek teeth, that's an awful lot of tooth material for just one animal to produce, right? So big, heavy teeth, lots of enamel, so they fossilize well, and a lot of teeth per animal. So right away, your chances of finding things are really enhanced because of the way horses have evolved. Not only that, but horses appear after the age of the dinosaurs. So if you look at this very generalized geologic map of the United States, all of the yellow is dirt from the Cenozoic. That's the time when horses are here. So the youngest sediments are the most common sediments. They're the most widely distributed, and they're going to have horses in them, horse teeth in them. So just the odds are stacked in favor of finding lots and lots and lots of horse teeth. Now, change of subject. Let's go back to ancient Greece. I want to set the intellectual background. I'm sorry if this is a little off the topic, but let's go back to Aristotle, who is one of the first philosophers to try to come up with a documentation of all the organisms living on the planet, his Historia Animalia. And he came up with what he called the Scala Nictore, which is a ranking, a hierarchy of different kinds of animals. And in his view, in this view with humans at the top and then mammals, cetaceans, and so on below, you can't move from one level to the next. Everything is more or less immutable. So it's different animals and organisms in relationship to one another, and as they appear is pretty much how they're going to stay. Later on, after Greece ended, Rome began, and people started incorporating that, and then they started combining it with Christianity. So you started to have the idea that we take that same philosophy, but now we put God at the top. So it's still the same sort of thing. You just have this hierarchy. But again, the idea is that there is no change. You don't move up levels or down levels. Everything retains its relative position respective to everything else. Change doesn't happen. And this brings us to Carolus Linnaeus, who is the individual who came up with the naming system that we use today still as paleontologists and biologists. You're probably familiar with some of this when you hear terms like species and genus and family and so on. This is the way it would work for Homo sapiens. The species name is Homo sapiens, the genus is Homo, family Hominidae, order Primates, class Mammalia, and so on. Linnaeus is the individual who came up with this and codified it so that it still holds up today. If you wanted to switch organisms and look at things like horses, it still holds up. Now the order is Perissodactyla, family Equidae, genus Equus, and for the living domestic horse, the species is Equus caballus. Okay, so pretty straightforward, but it is based on the idea that, at least initially, it's based on the idea that these animals aren't changing. So once you have nailed them down and named them and defined them, at least preliminarily, you locked them in place. It was an attempt to understand God's creation, looking at what he created. The challenge is that horse teeth are very complicated. Those enamel patterns can vary widely between different teeth in an individual animal, over the age, over the lifespan of an animal as the teeth wear down, and between different individuals and between different species. And so all of those changes can really, really complicate things. But when people first start finding horse teeth, they aren't aware of that. So they start finding horse teeth, looking at the enamel and saying, I think this is a species. I think this is a species. And looking at little enamel variations and naming species. In fact, this is the first tooth that was ever discovered in the Americas. First fossil horse tooth that was recognized as actually being from a fossil horse. They had found horse teeth before, but since Europeans were and Native Americans were riding horses, if you found horse teeth, you just assume it was intrusive. But this was found in South America, and it was found in 1832 or 1833. Anybody want to guess who found it? Some guy named Charles Darwin, who found it in 1833. How cool is that? He found the first horse known from the Americas that was recognized, and typical Darwin, he didn't recognize it. He just, what is this horse doing here next to this slough? It was when he sent it back to England and Richard Owen looked at it and said, oh, well, it's next to the slough because it's an Ice Age horse. That's exactly what Richard Owen sounded like, by the way. Write that down. And so Richard Owen immediately named a new species, Equus curvidens, 1845. And that's how it starts. And that's how you start getting lists like this. But it gets worse because this list was then exacerbated. These are all horses that were named by a guy named Joseph Leidy before Darwin even published The Origin of Species in 1859. So there's no evolutionary theory to build off of. Leidy's just naming species. And he's not the only one. There's Joseph Leidy and there's Edward Drinker Cope. Some of you paleontology buffs might recognize that name. Same thing with Othniel Charles Marsh. They named a lot of dinosaurs, but they were also naming horse species. And as some of you who are really into your paleontology might know, Cope really hated Marsh, and Marsh really hated Cope. And so the two of them expressed their anger and hatred and rage by trying to outname the other one. They would blow up each other's sites, they would steal fossils, they would send spies into other, and they would try to name as many possible species as they could, to the point where Leidy gave up and left paleontology altogether. He just completely had enough. So because of this, the uncertainty of what species are, of how to name them, of variation in horses, the ubiquity of horse fossils, horse teeth all over the continent, you end up just those three individuals have named over a third or about a third of the horse species names that are out there. That's very frustrating for a paleontologist because of something called the principle of priority, which is another taxonomic term. I don't want to get into it, but it means that the earliest valid name for a species is the one you have to use. You can't come along and just name something different later. If you do, and somebody compares them, then you're stuck with it. And the example many of you might be familiar with, again, those of you who grew up like I did with this animal known as Brontosaurus. And then it turns out that there was an earlier fossil that would have been called Brontosaurus, but it had been named something called Apatosaurus. According to the principle of priority, Brontosaurus disappears and Apatosaurus becomes a valid name. And many of you might be aware, might remember when that happened. And you hear that Brontosaurus never existed. Of course it existed, but it had the wrong name because of the principle of priority. And it does turn out that later, more scientists have looked at more fossils and determined, well, maybe Brontosaurus is valid after all. This is not a dinosaur talk, so we are not going to go there. If you would like to ask me about Brontosaurus, please don't. Because I have to deal with this, because the same thing applies. Every one of these names has to be tested against every horse we find to see which one is the best named one. It is a lot of work. I have my own favorites. In terms of this, like the La Brea horse, I think the name Equus occidentalis is probably valid. This is beyond me. This is something that I can't handle by myself. Fortunately, I'm working with a team. We've already published a paper. We're working on more. And this is what we're trying to do, is evaluate all those names, throw out the ones that we can reject easily, and then figure out which of the remaining names are the best names to use, and finally establish a good working basis for studying Ice Age horses in North America, at least in terms of what we call them. So that's what's going on now. This is my own scheme. I'm not saying my co-authors agree with me on this. Again, this is a work in progress. We're all working, but I just want to give this to you as an example that there are the various scientific names that I might use on the left. And then you've got the body size, the nature of the cheek teeth, the metapodials or foot bones, and whether they're skinny or stout. That's one of the characters. And then incisor cups. Remember, I told you to remember incisor cups back at the beginning of the talk. By combining these characteristics, you can break these animals out into different species, and then you can use that hopefully reliably. And then you can break them out by time period. And so suddenly you're starting, in my view, to get a handle on this. So for example, Equus occidentalis, one of the best characters I like is that its lower incisors, you've seen here on the left, don't have those enamel cups at all. They have flat spatula-like teeth versus the Equus scotti that you see on the right that does have those enamel cups. So at a glance, if you have the right fossils preserved, you can tell these animals apart. Okay, with me so far? That horse from Las Vegas I mentioned, the juvenile horse, and I told you it's got these infundibula. This is clearly not the same species as the La Brea horse, because it's got a difference. I'm assuming it's a species difference. If it's just a regional population difference, I don't know how to get at those data. I actually do, but I'm not that part of the talk yet. But I could interpret this to be a different species. So right there, you've got two large horses living near each other, one in Los Angeles, one in Las Vegas, but because their anatomical configuration is different, you can consider them to be two different species. And this can be applied elsewhere. For example, here in Oregon, at an Ice Age site called Fossil Lake, which has produced Ice Age horse fossils, like this beautiful jaw, which is at the South Dakota School of Mines, because they've collected in Fossil Lake. Now, want to see the incisors? Thank you. That's what they look like. And hold on. Right there. You see those enamel cups and this open enamel cup? So I would call this another Equus scotti. In fact, that's what I am calling it. So there you have it. What do you do if you don't have teeth and you don't have those incisors? And this is where I was very happy to work with a colleague of Wynn's and mine. This is the Paisley Cave site in Oregon, which is one of the earliest documented occurrences of human beings anywhere in North America. Outside of the footprints in white sands and some other, but here you've got actual organic remains in the form of coprolites or fossil poop that dates back to more than 14,000 years in age. And there are horses found with it. This is a horse toe bone, but that's about all they found at Paisley Caves is horse toe bones, which aren't teeth, last I checked. So what do you do with that? Well, you talk to smart people. This on the left is Dr. Brianna McHorse, seen here with somebody you may know. This is from a recent conference, and Brianna is, among other things, a data analyst, as well as a horse rider and a horse fossil specialist. So we published a paper where we took measurements of those toe bones and compared them with measurements of toe bones from other horses all over North America, and then statistically evaluated where those specimens would fall. And it turns out that they fall in a group called Equus conversidens. And so here we are thinking, we're so good, we're so smart. We've got the incisor cups, we've got statistics, we are breaking these animals out in reliable, demonstrable, repeatable ways, which is what science is supposed to do. So really doing a lot of, I thought, very useful work. And then this happened, genomics. And I'm being a little mean. I work with genomicists and geneticists, and they're wonderful people and I love them, but bear with me. Genomics is the study of genetic information in animals. And one of the leading scientists is this individual, Ludovic Orlando. Maybe you've heard of him. He just published a book on Horse evolution, it is in French, so I meant to advertise it here, but anyway, he has been fascinated with horses and horse evolution and horse domestication for his entire professional career. So when I talked to you earlier about Przewalski's horses not being truly wild, but being feral, that's Ludovic Orlando. When I talked about donkeys being domesticated as pack animals, Ludovic Orlando. He's everywhere. And in terms of fossils, he's interested in fossils coming out of areas up north preserved in permafrost. And because these fossils are preserved in permafrost, they are essentially frozen remnants of the Ice Age. Look at that hoof. That is an Ice Age horse that still has the fur, still has the ligaments, still has the tendons, which means it still has DNA. And genomics people can get at that DNA. So Grant Zazula and Ross McPhee and Beth Shapiro are part of a team of scientists who have been looking at this stuff with Ludovic Orlando and have been analyzing these different organisms. And because the permafrost is increasingly melting as well as being processed by miners, there are a lot of fossils to deal with. And so this is an analysis you're going to continue to see ongoing in the years ahead. It's not just up in the Yukon and Alaska. Here in northern Wyoming, there's a site called Natural Trap Cave, headed up by Dr. Julie Meechan, and it's a natural trap. There's a hole in the ceiling of this cave. So horses or other animals running along at the surface, they hit that hole and they fall 86 feet to their death. And then they leave their bones and teeth behind. So you can find the bones of these animals. And because there's a temperature gradient, you can be at 90, 95 degrees at the surface. You get down to the bottom of that cave, it's 35, 40 degrees, which means it is a pocket of cold from the ice ages that has never gone away, which means these are also actually preserved bones, which means they can be sampled for DNA as well. Now, the reason I bring that up, I'll come back to Natural Trap Cave in a moment. Natural Trap Cave was initially excavated back in the 1970s by Kansas University. This is the museum at Kansas. And they're holding those fossils of horses that were excavated at that time. And various scientists using the morphological approach I've been talking about have suggested that there are 3 species of horse in this one assemblage, or 4 species of horse in this one assemblage, or 5 species of horse in this one assemblage. Give me a break. So my colleague Lillian Spencer and I actually went there, and Lillian developed it's not her technique, but her way of approaching it would never have occurred to me, where you don't necessarily look at the enamel patterns, you look at the wear patterns and whether they're sharp or rounded and what that indicates about what the animals were eating. And you can see the differences, hopefully, between sharpened cusps like you see there versus virtually non-existent cusps like you see there. This is reflecting what these animals are eating. And what you see is they're partitioning the environment. You have most of these animals are eating coarse fodder, as you would expect, but some of them are not. Some of them are having tooth-on-tooth abrasion and apparently eating somewhat softer foods. You combine this with measurements of the foot bones, and what you see is 2 different groups breaking out, a stilt-legged form and a stout-legged form, based on measurements of the foot bones. So that was what Lillian and I published just last year. Now, how does that compare to the genomic information? Well, Julie Meechan's team came up with this paper where, if you read it, it says, based on the entire genetic content they obtained, they show up 2 species of horse. One of them a stout-legged horse, more like living horses, and one of them a stilt-legged form that is extinct. So Lillian and I very smugly say, yeah, we know what we're talking about. We're good at this stuff because now we're paralleling what's going on with the genetics. Here's another cave. This one is outside of Las Vegas, Nevada. It's called Gypsum Cave, Nevada, Gesundheit. Gypsum Cave was excavated back in the 1930s for archaeology, people looking for evidence of early man. And did prehistoric man kill sloths? And I love that picture. Gypsum Cave is empty. There are no more fossils in it, but the fossils are preserved at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles County. And so you can access them and you can study them and measure them. And that's what I did. And once again, those measurements there plot with the stilt-legged horses, right? But these horses, they're not preserved in permafrost. They're not preserved in ice at the bottom or cold temperatures at the bottom of Natural Trap Cave. It's the opposite. They're preserved in the hot, dry Nevada desert. These are mummified horses. in this cave. They still have the flesh, they still have the ligaments and the tendons holding this joint together, for example, and you can still get DNA out of them. So this is a paper published, one of the early genomics papers in 2005 that argued that you could see that same thing with you stilt-legged horses having a unique genetic signature, right? So still we're doing great. Interestingly, there was in the paper that in the 1930s talked about the gypsum cave fossils that mentioned a horse skull that was supposed to have been found right there. And my colleague Christina Lutz and I went through the entire collection and could not find a horse skull. We let the collections manager and the assistant collections manager know to keep their eyes open, and they found it. Would you like to know where it is? It was in the modern horse sample. Because the preservation is so good, it looked like last week's lunch. So they put it in the comparative collection where it's been sitting for decades. And just to make sure everybody knows what it is, they even wrote what it is in pencil on the top of the bone, burro or wild ass. It is in fact a 13,500-year-old horse from the end of the ice ages in this Nevada cave. And so Christina and I wrote a little paper on it back in 2014, and this is where things get weird. This is where I start to doubt myself. We sampled the skull for DNA as well. That's how we got the date on it, but we also sampled it for DNA. It was a sample run by Dr. Pete Heinzman and again, Dr. Beth Shapiro. And here are the results. Here's where that skull and the limb bones and all the other stilt-legged horses from North America that have DNA plot that yellow bar. Here is all other horses, domestic horses, feral horses, zebras, donkeys, burros, all of them. This horse from Gypsum Cave and its relatives are completely separate. Not only that, they separated out 5 million years ago genetically. And that's based on a complete mitochondrial genome and a partial but substantial nuclear genome. That is powerful data suggesting that this is a completely different lineage. And yet, as you saw from what they wrote on top of it, it looks like last week's lunch. It looks just like a horse you'd find in the desert today, which to me still makes no sense at all. You'd expect it to preserve some primitive characters or to have evolved in a different direction. Nothing. It looks like a small horse, and that's it, except it's got some long feet. So this is very frustrating. As a consequence, we named a new genus. We named it Harrington hippus after a scientist in Canada. This was not necessarily popular with other scientists. For example, Dr. Christina Barone Ortiz up at the Royal Alberta Museum disagreed with our interpretation. She and her colleagues published a paper. And she was also doing genomic studies as well as morphological studies. And she looked at this horse, which is a stout-legged horse from a cave down in Mexico. This is Equus conversidens, according to multiple published papers, and she got stilt-legged horse DNA out of it. So now I'm even more confused because I was breaking these smaller horses out, the ones at the bottom here, I'm breaking them out into different groups. The stout-legged ones are the horses, and the stilt-legged ones are the Harrington hippus. And according to her, it is a sample of one. She only got DNA from one tooth, but still, according to her and her team, all of these horses are the same thing. Now, some of you are probably saying, well, that makes it easy. The big horses are the horses, the small horses are the Harrington hippus, and it doesn't matter. And forgive me, I want to remind you about that graph from Natural Trap Cave, where we had two different small horses in the assemblage that yielded completely different DNA. So no, it's just small horses doesn't work, which means potentially that metapodials aren't very good, foot bones aren't very good for these analyses. And in fact, that's been backed up by work in South America and currently by a PhD. She might have her PhD by now, but she was a candidate when she published this, looking at foot bones as taxonomic indicators and saying, no, they're too variable between regions. You can't do it. If you were at a single locality and you have two different sizes, then you can say you've got two different species. But once you start moving to different localities, that's out the window, because apparently what you're looking at is an environmental signal and not a systematic or taxonomic signal, which messes up my whole scheme, which is why my colleagues probably aren't going to use it, because you just lost all of this. A huge chunk of this database no longer potentially works. And this has me feeling very, very frustrated. I'm going, what do? I mean, you got genomics are going to destroy morphology-based paleontology. And I'm going to have headlines like this waiting for me in my future, where apparently I wasted my entire career going to other museums and looking at fossils and measuring them. And apparently it's not helpful. So what would you do if you were me? Somebody says dinosaurs. No, I'm a horse person. So what you do is you go to East Africa, you go to where they were looking for things like Lucy. This is the actual Lucy site. And you look at a completely different lineage of extinct horses that doesn't have anything to do with living horses and that has no living descendants. So nobody's going to get any DNA out of it at all. And I can say whatever I'm. This is Uregnathohippus. It is an extinct form of horse, three-toed horse, a Hipparionian horse. And this is actually what I am working on right now. I'm looking at more and more of these horses from the Hadar site and from the Lorenzo Milei site and from the Lady Gararu site. So this is me now. I've given up on Equus and I haven't. In fact, it's the reverse. Because of what I'm learning about North American horses, I can now apply that to these Ethiopian horses, these extinct Hipparionian horses, and say, just because we are seeing these things doesn't mean that they have a biological reality. That's the lesson of these horses. And it's a spooky one for a morphology-based paleontology, is that there appears to be a very strong fossilized biological signal that is not being reflected in the external appearance. There's a reality to these animals that we can't necessarily see just by looking at their remains. It's more complicated than that. And that's an important point. And I think any paleontologist needs to be aware of that. And actually outside of paleontology, I think realizing that appearance isn't everything is perhaps a very important point to make manifest. But in terms of these horses, that's where things stand at the moment. I also want to emphasize that when we talk about species, you do need to keep in mind that different scientists refer to species in different ways, and there's all sorts of different ways to define species. These here in yellow and underlined are just a few of the ones that can be applied to fossils. And then there are some that don't deal with fossils at all. So this is probably part of the issue as well, is that as we're looking to define different species, there's different ways to do it, but those different ways don't necessarily add up to the same answer. And so, who cares? They're horses. Why does this matter? Well, let me give you just one example, and I am almost finished. I'm winding up, but let me give you one example, which is feral horses today in North America that are perceived by many people as a challenge because there are so many of them. They are breeding, and they're breeding successfully, and their numbers are expanding, and they're having an impact on the range out there, which is why they are rounded up like this, why their numbers are controlled, why they're culled, and the Bureau of Land Management will adopt them out. This is because they are breeding so successfully. They're doing a great job biologically. And this is an article from the New York Times back in 2017, back when people actually listened to the New York Times, that talks about this very issue. The challenge is what people are looking at is horses as a pest. Horses as an introduced animal brought over by the Spanish, released into the wild, and now wreaking havoc. And we have to rein that in. That's one perspective. Another perspective from people who love horses and want them to succeed is the argument that because horses were integral parts of North American ecosystems for literally more than 55 million years, that they have priority, that we should give them priority. Just because there was a brief hiccup when they weren't here and then the Spanish brought them back, they should still be the ones we're looking for. They should be the ones we're taking care of and promoting. The challenge with that, as you can imagine, is that where these animals are dwelling is also where we have a lot of cattle. The beef industry owns much of the West. And I'm not going to comment on that at all, just to say that that means it's already an artificial environment that is keyed into economic factors that have nothing to do with biological reality. So unless you're willing to stop eating steaks like this, did you guys have dinner before you came? Anybody? And if you think this is bad, the next slide's even worse. This is from Lowry's in Los Angeles. This is one cart out of, I think, 5 or 6 on one night at one restaurant. And look at all the cattle in there. And this is just at steakhouses. Think about the hamburgers and everything. Our entire culture, and yes, I understand there are vegans and vegetarians among you, but Americans consume a lot of beef. And so there is a lot of economic power to that. And as long as that is the case, horses are going to continue to be seen as pests. Yes, they are supposed to be treated well and managed responsibly by the Bureau of Land Management according to federal regulations, but that is within the constraints of other actors in those areas, including the beef industry, which also has to be protected. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of movement on that front. What happens if the horses keep breeding? What is the response to that? Well, we have a historic example in Southern California, where in the mission times, horses escaped and they started breeding and they started breeding. They were quite popular in the area, but they did get out, they were breeding and they bred uncontrollably. Would you like to know how that challenge was resolved? You round up all the horses and you run them off of Dana Point into the Pacific Ocean. And that's what they did. So that is the end result of horses breeding out of control, right? So something has to give. I don't know what it is. What happens is horses are by themselves. During the ice ages and earlier times, they were part of a community. So they didn't have access to all of the forage themselves. They were competing against mammoths and bison and musk ox and ground sloths and all sorts of other organisms. So they partitioned the environment. Horses today don't have that. They're pretty much on their own, except for cattle. You also had horses being controlled by predators, animals like saber-toothed cats and dire wolves and other things that hunted them and ate them and helped control their populations. And in fact, in the American West today, this is a paper that just recently came out, 2021, that talked about how even today you have a relationship between feral donkeys and cougars that maintains something of that relationship, but that is one predator, not a host of predators. So you still don't have any real constraints on horse populations expanding. So you're going to continue to see that sort of growth. I don't have a good answer other than taking the horses on their own and setting them aside. But whatever needs to happen, you don't start using the ice ages as an example for what might be. The ice ages are gone. The environment has changed and it's not coming back. You don't treat it as a natural ecosystem because the presence of cattle is going to make that different. You need to manage the animals on their own terms. Think of them as living organisms, look at their requirements, both in terms of food, in terms of control, in terms of predation, and then maybe somehow set land aside and make that happen in some areas. That's about the only thing you can do. Otherwise, you're going to continue to have this catastrophic harvesting of horses, which is damaging to them and not terribly helpful in the long run. It's not really a solution. So this is why understanding how horses during the ice ages lived and died is important, because people are using that as an analogy for what we could be doing today. And I think that's an unfortunate idea. I think we need to think beyond that and realize the realities of how these animals are living and deal with that and work with the constraints of that. I'm not saying horses are bad. I'm not saying horses are pests at all. What I am saying is that we need to find a better solution than what's going on. In terms of ice age horses themselves, scientists debate all the time. And yes, we have genomics, and where you have genetic information, you can use it. Where you don't have genetic information, you can use morphology. We're still figuring it out. And so that is going to move forward. It is very frustrating. I thought I had all the answers, and now as I'm nearing retirement, I realize I've got to start relearning some things. Fortunately, there's a whole host of young scientists coming up who are much smarter than I am, who are going to be able to take up the reins and continue this. And so with that, thank you so much for coming out this evening. I hope you enjoy yourselves. I got a kick out of it. And so with that, I'd like to open this up for any questions. Thank you. Yes.
we have a question online, and we don't have two microphones, we'll just try to speak up, so I'm sorry to the online. Jacqueline Silveria says, excellent talk, Eric. Since metapodials are so problematic, do you think the species can be diagnosed by measurements from other bones in the post-cranial skeleton, like the backbones or the hip bones?
That's a good question. For those of you who might not have heard it, the question was if metapodials are problematic, foot bones are problematic for defining species or diagnosing species. Are there other postcranial elements, things outside the skull, that might be used better? And I think in most cases, the answer would be about the same, because those are all kind of size-related elements. They're related to the body size of the organism. So if what we're seeing about horses and their postcrania is correct, what we're looking at is changes in their foot structure and so on relative to where they're living, whether they're living in more desert conditions or more mountainous conditions or more open mesic conditions, that seems to maybe be having an effect on their feet. In terms of things like ribs and vertebrae, they're pretty generic. You can get large and small, and that's about as far as you can go. It's entirely possible that there are other bones out there that are more informative. Keep in mind that I've spent my career looking at foot bones. So if there are other bones in there that are taxonomically informative, I haven't been looking in the right places. So again, it's entirely possible that another scientist could look at that material and say, it was right here, you idiot. And they will say that. They'll find me in the rest home, they'll steal my Jell-O, and they'll say you're an idiot. And I'll sit there and take it because I'll be old. But anyway, thank you for that. Anybody else? Yes.
Why do you think the horse was extinct 11,000 years ago?
The question is, why do you think the horses went extinct 11,000 years ago? And I understand that Wynn is going to invite me up here next year for my extinction talk. It's a long story. I have my own theory. I actually published a paper on it back in 2010. The short version is climate change by itself doesn't work, because climate changed a lot during the ice ages. It went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Human overkill, I do not subscribe to. Part of that is where I am in Southern California. I work for a mitigation company. We go out on every construction site. Well, the ones that we win. But if we aren't there, some other mitigation company is there. And we do archaeology and paleontology. So if they're digging and they hit artifacts, they're found. If they hit fossils, they're found. And they've been doing it since the 1970s, and not one indication of humans and animals living together has ever come up. So if the people were there, they were keeping a very low profile. They weren't the uber hunters that we think of. And I think that's important. If you really listen to indigenous people and the way they relate to the natural world, it's different. It's not, Aldo Leopold referred to it back in the 40s as the difference between being part of a community versus looking at it as a commodity. And I think so much of the way we look at nature, whether we look at it as something to be used or something to be appreciated, we're still looking at it relative to us. And Native peoples didn't necessarily look at things the same way. And they actually write books about this and they talk about this. It's just, I think we need to listen to that. I'm not trying to glorify any of that. I'm just trying to say it is a different perspective. So when people start talking about people coming in and brutally hunting all these animals and just blowing through North America in 500 years and wiping out 35 species of large mammal, I think you're imparting to those people a certain way of looking at the natural world around them that they didn't have. And that, coupled with the fact that the evidence is so sparse, out of hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of ice age sites, there's maybe a dozen that are confirmed kill sites. Did people hunt these animals? Yes, absolutely. Could they hunt them to extinction? We hunted bison with rifles from trains for fun. And we almost exterminated them until the government stepped in to protect them. That is one species. So suddenly it doesn't make any sense. So I have real problems with overkill. That's my bias. I'm wearing it on my sleeve or nailing my colors to the mask. I don't think that happened. There was an idea that a comet hit the Earth and wiped them out. That's been pretty much dismissed by anybody with sense. And then there was an idea proposed by one scientist, Ross McPhee, who I mentioned earlier, who said maybe there was a virulent disease that hit. There's no evidence for that, and it would be a really weird disease that would go from dire wolves to saber-toothed cats to horses to bison to mammoths and so on, but would not go from lions to mountain lions. It would not go from dire wolves to timber wolves. So that doesn't make a lot of sense either. So all of the common explanations that are out there don't seem to work. My idea was that, as I mentioned, about 190,000 years ago, bison immigrate into North America from Eurasia. And about 40,000 years ago, their numbers go berserk. They really take off. So that by the end of the ice ages, they are the most common land mammal, large land mammal in North America. And then the climate changes. And I think I would love to learn how to computer model so that I could computer model this. But I think what happened is competition. And it was competition that was not seen during any earlier warming period because the bison weren't here in that abundance during those earlier warming periods. Whether that drove it or whether it was a contributing factor, I don't know. That would be what I would suggest, is that yes, it was climate, but it was climate coupled with competition from a relatively newly immigrated animal that provided, that was more common than the other animals. It's a big aggressive animal. It lives in herds. They compete for the same resources. It's like you hear about horses that get colicky if they drink dirty water. It's a disadvantage because I've watched bison in Yellowstone slurping down mud and doing just fine. So if you're having a warming period and a drying period and the plants are going away and the water's getting a little muddy, bison are just going to keep on churning and the horses are going to be at a disadvantage, and suddenly you're impacting an entire ecosystem across the continent. So that would be my response. I think it was probably something like that. However, that theory published in 2010 never really caught on. People will tell me to my face that it was a great idea, but then nobody quotes it. Yes.
Yeah, so I think I understand you say that after Bowtie, there were no true wild horses anymore. And if that's so, I guess I need a definition of what a true wild horse is, and what about zebras? I mean,
Thank you. I should have been more clear. The question is, if Bowtie horses aren't, if Przewalski's horses aren't true wild horses, then I said there are no wild horses. And the question is, well, what about zebras? You are absolutely correct. I misspoke. Zebras are usually, when you talk about horses, there are so-called true horses, and then there are donkeys and asses, and there's hemionians, which are called half-asses. No, don't. And that's what they're called in the literature. That's not me. And zebras and so on. So true horses are apparently extinct. Przewalski's horses were thought to be the last true horses, and they are feral descendants of domesticated animals. So they're technically not fully wild. Zebras are absolutely wild and absolutely successful. And there are still some wild asses and half-asses out there as well. So yes, there are wild equids on the planet today who did succeed. But horses, as we think of horses, did not make it. Good question. Thank you.
so
Yes.
along with that, are the wild horse, what we call the wild horses that we even have in Oregon, descended from what Spanish brought?
That's the current interpretation,
Oh.
is that the wild horses you have here in America, in Oregon, in Nevada, in Wyoming, all over the place, in Montana, those are all descended from animals that were brought over by the Spanish. Now, there was a dissertation that was published a few years ago by an indigenous scientist who argued that that's not necessarily the case, that horses didn't necessarily go extinct, that maybe they survived. And I can say that I have a challenge with that. And what we talked about earlier is exactly the challenge. Horses left to their own devices are going to breed, and they're going to breed successfully, and their numbers are going to be there. And indigenous people would have been more than smart enough to see this large animal and take advantage. Look what happened when the Spanish did bring them. And as soon as the native people saw them, they became some of the most astoundingly competent and capable horse riders the world has ever seen in a very short period of time. So if horses were here, the people living here at the time would have taken advantage of that. And we would have the archaeological evidence for it. We would have bones, we would have ornaments, we would have whatever they use, all of that would be preserved. And even if it wasn't in an archaeological context, it would be in a neo-paleontological context, younger than, you know, since the end of the ice ages. In natural settings, you'd see those horse bones because horses would breed successfully and there would be so many of them that they'd be preserved. So the fact that we don't have that record, the fact that the indigenous people didn't take advantage of them, the way they took advantage, clear advantage of bison and worked with bison, and we see evidence of bison all over the place. That's what you would expect to see. And since we don't see that, I don't agree that horses survived the end of the ice ages. I think that it's a good argument that they went extinct. But thank you for asking. Well, thank you again very much, everybody, for coming out. I really appreciate it. It's nice to see all of you. And I am going to hang around for a few minutes. And so if you have any questions you want to ask me, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Thank you very much.
From the furry campus, there's an incredible presentation. Thank you and lots of lots.
They laugh at the bad jokes.
Yeah, they.
That's what the jokes are for.
Hi. Got a quick question. When you talked about the Southwestern, and then you found them side by side. Could the Navy have like without like the same as the Misty of the islands in North America? How we take those, we feed them regular diets.
See, that's what
I mean.
I would like to do.